All right. Hi, everyone. I am the unenlightened philosophy bro for the purposes of this video. And as you can see, I'm doing another video talking about Slavoj Zizek, the famous Lacanian slash Hegelian slash Marxist philosopher whose approach to philosophy and life I like. And this is going to be another one in my series on his book called Less Than Nothing, and this one is about his critique of enlightenment within a specific context and a specific type of Buddhist enlightenment also. So let me get into the clip here and then I'll comment on it. Okay. The point here is not to criticize Buddhism, but merely to emphasize the irreducible gap between subjective authenticity and moral goodness in the sense of social responsibility. So I think that's already a good thing to good aspect of this paragraph to get into right there. So there's an irreducible gap between subjective authenticity and moral goodness. So, like, to oversimplify it, there's a big gap, an irreducible gap between authenticity and moral goodness. So, he goes on to explain this more, but that's interesting because he's it sounds like he's saying that, like, he's implying that it's inauthentic to be morally good, but that's not actually what he's saying. He's saying that there's an irreducible gap between subjective authenticity and moral goodness in the sense of social responsibility. So sometimes it's socially irresponsible to be authentically good in certain situations. And he's going to go on to explain what he means by this specifically. Okay, so there's an irreducible gap between subjective authenticity and moral goodness in the sense of social responsibility. The difficult thing to accept is that one can be totally authentic in overcoming one's false self and yet still commit horrible crimes, and vice versa, of course. One can be a caring subject, morally committed to the full, while existing in an inauthentic world of illusion with regard to oneself. That's interesting too. So one can be totally authentic in overcoming one's false self and yet still commit horrible crimes. So an you can be authentically you can be an authentic yet morally bad person, right? You can discover your you can overcome your false self, accept your true self. But what if your true authentic self is a morally bad person, right? So being authentic is important and being morally good is important. But if you're an authentically bad person and you're pretending to be morally good, are you really an authentically bad person or person rather? And are you really doing moral good if you are not actually authentically a good person and you're just pretending to be one? Or yeah, and you can just have this inauthentic world of illusion with regard to oneself, as he's saying. Okay, well, existing in an inauthentic world of illusion with regard to oneself. Let me just take a drink here. Okay, this is why all the desperate attempts by Buddhists to this is what I like him kind of insulting Buddhism but clarifying some nuance too. This is why all the desperate attempts by Buddhists to demonstrate how respect and care for others are necessary step towards and conditions of enlightenment misfire. I think that's interesting. So these are desperate attempts to demonstrate how respect and care for others are necessary steps towards and conditions of enlightenment. So, respect and care for others to Buddhists. Buddhists are wrong when they say, and he goes on to clarify certain types of Buddhists. The certain types of Buddhists are wrong when they say it's inevitable to have respect and care for others in order to be authentically enlightened. There's actually nothing wrong with your being your authentic self if you're not if not necessarily anything wrong if you don't have respect and care for others. So I guess if you can, in a certain type of or Buddhism that he's about to mention, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be your authentic self who does not respect and care for people. Maybe you can be enlightened about yourself, but be like content with not liking anyone else, right? Maybe you can just be a lonely curmudgeon who doesn't have any friends or anything, but still be happy. Well, actually, I guess just not even necessarily a lonely person. Maybe you can just be a loner but not lonely and prefer having time by yourself, and that's your authentic self, and you don't respect or care for anyone else. That could be still a morally good thing depending on how you look at it. If you don't morally do bad things to people, but you're an authentically bad person, then you could still technically be an enlightened person, I suppose. But this is why exactly why Zizek is saying that this sort of thinking and this thought and this premise that respect and care for others is an inherent aspect of Buddhist enlightenment is false, right? Because you can't reconcile your authentically bad self with moral goodness if you're an authentically morally bad person. So, okay, let's get back to this here. One can be a caring subject, morally committed to the full while existing in an inauthentic world of illusion with regard to oneself. Okay. This is why all the desperate attempts by Buddhists. Oh yeah, I read this part. This is why all the desperate attempts by Buddhists to demonstrate how respect and care for others are necessary steps towards and conditions of enlightenment misfire. Okay, so he mentions a particular Zen Buddhist here too. Suzuki himself was much more honest in this regard when he pointed out that Zen so he's mentioning this within the context of specifically Zen Buddhist meditation slash enlightenment. He's talking about a meditation technique here. So Suzuki himself was much more honest in this regard when he pointed out that Zen is a meditation technique which implies no particular ethico political stance. In his political life, a Zen Buddhist may be a liberal, a fascist, or a communist. I think that's interesting because people assume that, all of Buddhism advocates for you just being like all progressive and enlightened and accepting of everyone, but you can be an authoritarian Zen Buddhist apparently because they try to make this separation between Buddhism and politics, which I think is actually a false notion. When philosophers have been trying to do that throughout human history. A lot of them have trying to do that, like pragmatists like John Dewey and Richard Rorty, and a lot of people throughout human history, of course, have wanted to separate their spirituality or their religion from their politics. And I don't think it's really even possible to do that, although it can certainly be a good idea sometimes because your political views and your religious views, it is a good idea to keep them separate to an extent rather, but they're almost inevitably going to influence each other, even if it's only slightly. So they're going to come out and your biases are going to get political and spiritual or religious biases are going to come out in the way you view the world, the way you practice your Buddhism or whatever your political ideology is as well. Okay, so like you said, a Zen Buddhist may be a liberal, a fascist, or a communist. Again, the two vacuums never coincide. So the two vacuums of authenticity, subjective authenticity versus moral goodness, as he said, those are the two vacuums that never coincide. He says. In order to be fully engaged ethico-politically, it is necessary to exit the inner peace of one's subjective authenticity. I think that's interesting too, and to kind of explain what he's saying there, I think this is to me the main point of this paragraph. He's saying that enlightenment can have flaws and it's not always a good idea because you don't want to be enlightened and accepting of everyone and an authentically morally good person if you're trying to be a political activist. If you want to be a political activist, then enlightenment is bad for that, and you should not be enlightened enlightened if you are trying to be a political activist, because you need to be angry and fight for change if you're a political activist, right? Even if you're any brand of extremist, or like a not just a liberal or conservative, but literally a fascist or a communist, that can be the case, right? That it's if you're doing that, even regardless of your political persuasion, if you're trying to be any kind of political activist whatsoever, you shouldn't be enlightened, because then you won't be angry and demanding change enough, right? So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. He's basically talking about the fact that enlightenment can have its downsides. It has its place and it can be good, but you shouldn't just necessarily practice it all the time, especially if you want to be politically active or something. I would say you can probably try to do both, and not everyone wants to be a political activist anyway. Probably most people don't. I don't want to be a political activist, and a lot of people don't as well. But I mean, even if you're just talking about everyday life situations, sometimes maybe you're being treated badly by a bully or some shit in life, because they exist all over the world. And maybe you need to get mad and confront them. You shouldn't just be enlightened all the time, right? I mean, here's another religious example I remember is that, in the Bible, Jesus would get mad occasionally. He got mad when he went into that temple and people were collecting taxes or something like that and trying to make money from the church, which he was mad about. So even Jesus got mad sometimes, and you don't have to be Christian or religious to admire Jesus as a character, even if you think he's a fictional character, which I don't think he is. He was an admirable person, and even he got angry sometimes. All right. Anyway, I think I've said enough about that. I thought that was a really interesting point that Slavoj Zizek makes, as he always does. Or I mean, his points are always interesting, even if I disagree with them. And I think this is a really interesting point. I'm not sure I entirely agree, but it's, as always, it's interesting. All right. Anyway, thanks again, everyone, for watching. Check out my playlist with my other Slavoj Zizek videos on his book Less Than Nothing, and I've made a bunch of clips about his work as well, and clips from my videos about his book. So check those out as well. Probably the next one I'm going to release is going to be a clip. I think probably it's going to be another one from my podcast with Jared Bauer from the Wisecrack YouTube channel, on which they talk about politics viewed through the lens of popular culture, like video games, movies, and TV shows. So check out that clip and click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Smash the like button, make sweet love to it, elbow drop it, whatever you want to do, as long as you press it. And check out the link for my Patreon page. The link is in the description as always. And like I always say, most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And philosophy and Slavoj Zizek are awesome. And think about enlightenment. Are there downsides to it? Let me know in the comments. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.